Hi, my name is Carrie Travis, and I'm going to be presenting the Old Testament survey. So we're going to be talking about why do we need the Old Testament? Because a lot of people actually think that we don't need the Old Testament. One disbelief that people have why they don't believe that we need the Old Testament is that they think the New Testament is a Christian book while the Old Testament is a Jewish book. We're going to be going through different disbeliefs like this and disproving them, talking about why they're not true and why we do need the Old Testament. So to disprove that the Old Testament is a Jewish book, that's not true, because the earliest Christians, like the Apostle Paul, said that the Old Testament is Christian. Jesus referenced the Old Testament in his teachings over and over again. So, how to be a follower of Christ, he referenced the Old Testament for that. And then Paul, the Apostle Paul, referenced the Old Testament for how to build the Christian church. Therefore, it is Christian. Within the New Testament, the Old Testament was referenced over 300 times. Another disbelief that people have is they think that the New Testament corrects the Old Testament. They think that the Old Testament is saying that we are saved by the law, whereas in the New Testament now we're saved by grace. But actually, in the Old Testament times, they were also saved by grace. So Matthew 5:17 through 20 says, "Do not think that I came to destroy the law or the prophets." This is Jesus talking. "I did not come to destroy, but to fulfill. For assuredly I say to you, till heaven and earth pass away, one dot or just one tittle will by no means pass from the law till all is fulfilled." And so even though they needed to obey the law in the Old Testament, they did not obey it perfectly. But they were still able to go into the promised land because of grace. They couldn't obey the law to be able to be free. That was impossible for them. But by their faith in God, turning to God, through grace they were saved. In the Old Testament, just like in the New Testament it teaches. Another disbelief in the Old Testament is that the New Testament replaces the Old Testament. And this is not true, because Paul said to understand the Christian faith, you need to understand the Old Testament. The Old Testament teaches us about God, and God is the same, but it teaches more sides of him in the Old Testament and then throughout. The more you read about God throughout the Bible, the more you learn about him. And it teaches us about God's people, the story that he created, and it gives us stories of people who give us good examples of how to live for God and how to not live for God, how to love people and what it looks like to not love people. And then also within the Old Testament, there are so many references to Jesus. The Old Testament points people to Jesus and proves Jesus is who he says he is because of the evidence in the Old Testament that has been stated hundreds of years before then the New Testament is fulfilled. The next disbelief is that God in the Old Testament is a different God. Well, this is not true. Hebrews 13:8 says, Jesus Christ is the same yesterday and today and forever. So the Old Testament and the New Testament, God is the same throughout, but they show us different sides of God, different sides of the same God. In the Old Testament, we see how just God is, how fair he is. And then in the New Testament, we see that he is merciful. So if I told you a story of when my little brother was first learning how to be safe by going on walks with me and staying on the correct side of the road and looking at traffic, and I was very patient with him and very, slow to anger and repeated myself over and over again to make sure he was safe. And then I told you a story about how now he's 11 years old and he ran into traffic without looking and how I was stern with him and there was a consequence for his action. It's not that I'm a different person at once I was patient, but now at a different time later then I'm more stern. No, it's the fact that for different circumstances we need different things. When my brother was little and just learning, he needed more patience to learn. But now that he's older and he knows better, if I was just patient with him, he wouldn't learn. He needs consequences for his actions when he knows better to help him develop his character. And so it's the same with God's people. We need different things at different times. And so he is the same, but we see different characteristics of him as he interacts with his people. And then lastly, we wouldn't care about having a relationship with God if it wasn't for the Old Testament teaching us how separated we are from God. In Leviticus, it shows us just how separated God and his people were and how much they had to do to try to get close to God, and nothing they did was ever perfect because their sin was just too much. And then in the New Testament, when Jesus washes away our sins by dying for us, that just shows us the weight of sin, and it shows us how far we are from God and what we need to do to be able to be close to him. If it wasn't for the Old Testament, we would never know that we were ever so far from God, and then we wouldn't crave to be close to him in the same way. Well, thank you very much for listening.